So yes, I believe that leaves us our last main topic, which is yours.
Yes, on the 6th of February, which damn, that was a while ago. Um, I woke up, I opened Twitter, I saw this trans guy being called a trans misogynist for a whole bunch of stuff that he didn't say, which is something I've seen happen again and again and again. And something just kind of broke within me. And a whole lot of stuff I had been sitting on for months that I hadn't said because I was worried about backlash or whatever. I finally talked about that. I made a thread, and by I finally talked about that, made a thread. I mean, I it took me an entire day to put my thoughts together, and it was an absolute mess. And I put out this thread thinking that it would be horrible, and I'd be in loads of trouble, and I get piled, and I get massive amounts of harassment. And very fortunately, I actually got an overwhelmingly positive response. The only harassment I received was from two people who were going around, going out of their way to be awful. I just blocked them. That was fine. But yeah, I got a very positive response, and I the response was very much one of people saying basically, "Oh my God, it's in words." And so I guess I just want to read through this thread, and I can expand on it a bit because, of course, Twitter's character limits. Uh, I mean, I had to condense quite a lot, and I can also, uh, when I tweeted it, the feelings were very raw. I can hopefully bring some clear ideas to the table, and kind of just talk about the situation. So I tweeted, "quote I've realized I can't prove any of this. I mean, my whole point is that the game is rigged, so I'm just going to say it. Being a trans man in feminist spaces, even especially trans inclusive feminist spaces, feels exactly like being in an abusive relationship. I'm not joking or exaggerating when I say that. The walking on eggshells, the self-doubt, the self-blame, it feels exactly like a reaction to abuse. It's so bad that I've considered leaving feminist spaces entirely." End quote. Um, I just want to highlight, I really was not joking. When I say this feels like a reaction to abuse, been in, I've been emotionally abused for my entire life. I know what it feels like. Um, and it felt exactly, it has felt exactly the same. I think I've even gotten flashbacks to abuse I've received, not related to this, because of the stuff that I've seen and the stuff that's happened to me. Yes, quote, "People keep insisting that trans men react negatively to the way we're treated because we don't want to acknowledge and take responsibility for our privilege. Thing is, I don't feel this way about my white privilege, my able-bodied privilege, my singlet privilege, etc. Acknowledging my privileges can be scary and difficult, and I often worry about messing up. Sometimes I get frustrated and overwhelmed, and I occasionally feel like I'm being asked for too much, even though I know I'm not. But I have never, ever processed it as abuse, not once." End quote. Um, I've seen people actually go so far as to insist that any time a trans man objects to the way trans men are treated or points out an issue, it's just trans men not wanting to be held accountable, even trans men being abusive. I saw someone straight up argue that trans men are just abusive oppressors who hate accountability. And I actually worried for quite a long time that that was possibly true. The deep down inside me, there was this bigotry that I just hadn't noticed until I realized that day that I don't have this problem with any other privilege that I have. It is just when people talk about trans men having male privilege that I have this problem. Uh, quotes on a definitely completely unrelated note, discussions of white privilege, able-bodied privilege, etc., don't rely on blatantly contradictory arguments, unapologetic double standards, derailing and minimization, or thinly veiled baiting. End quote. These examples I'm about to give, these are real examples that I from specific situations I remember. They're not just things that I'm imagining could happen. So, quote, for example, contradictory argument. Trans men aren't hated for being men, but because they're seen as women. However, trans men have male privilege. Quote, unapologetic double standard. Bi people don't have straight privilege because being closeted isn't a privilege. However, trans men have male privilege because they pass as cis men. End quotes. I want to clarify here that I didn't get to say it because character limit. I'm not saying that biphobia isn't a thing or that bi people aren't accused of having straight privilege, but
it's a bullshit argument.
It is a bullshit argument. My argument here is, no one seemed to have a misunderstand, but I just want to clarify that my argument is that the problems with that argument are, I think, much less controversial than trans men trying to say that we don't have male privilege, even if we pass as cis men. Quotes, derailing and minimization. It doesn't matter that attempts to block transition-related healthcare center on trans men. Trans men aren't oppressed because they don't experience insert oppression women experience, end quote. This is actually in reference to the Kira Bell case. Of course, you, Ethel, pointed out to me several months ago that the attempted genocide of trans children in the UK was hinged on preventing trans men specifically and some non-binary people from transitioning.
Yeah. It's like, we understand that when transphobes talk about men, scare quotes, men, they're talking about trans women. But when they talk about girls, impressionable girls, irreversible damage on girls, we have this suddenly, like, so many of us just don't realize that, hang on a second, they're talking about trans boys, or non-binary, if add non-binary folk, And I do think that that's something that is just, like, it makes us completely incapable of actually tackling their arguments because, like, in the same way that with, like, the autism mentioned earlier and the whole stripping of autonomy thing, it's not trans girls they're trying to strip of their autonomy. Yeah, they love the fact that denying trans girls medication will result in them dying, but that's not the reason they go around talking about, our young lesbians, and I'm putting in air quotes here, big air quotes, our young lesbians are being convinced that their boys have become heterosexual and the normal heteronormative lifestyle, and again, we see that same stripping of autonomy, and that's a very impactful thing to tackle. Trans men need to be at the front of that conversation if we ever want to fucking tackle it.
And also it means that a lot of transphobia is going under the radar because people see that and they're like, oh, it's misogyny. They're saying that girls shouldn't have autonomy. And no, I mean, yeah, they think girls shouldn't have autonomy. But as you pointed out, Gillick competence was something that people had not managed to overturn when it was cis girls accessing contraception, etc. But when it was trans boys, that's when they got the momentum they needed to overturn it.
Yeah. Even though, like, it's funny because hormonal birth control works by hormones and it actually carries the same risk as, like, HRT, which I believe is a slight increase in aneurysms, if I remember correctly, blood clots, because hormones affects blood. Birth control has the exact same slight. It's a very minor increase, but it is statistically significant. Hormonal birth control can result in that as well. That's why certain people are, like, directed away from it if they have blood clotting issues, because that can multiply the possibility. It's really interesting because, like, when it talks about HRT causing, like, aneurysms as well, it's like, well, again, I don't see you right now campaigning against, like, hormonal birth control, which is the same thing, and puberty blockers don't have that effect either. It's just HRT, but yeah.
Riley is also pointing out that the reason why I'm guessing referencing Lily Kay, but I'm not sure.
It's also
No, probably.
it's the barrister. I've forgotten her name.
Yeah, the reason why that person doesn't want she doesn't want trans masks to transition is goes back to sexual assaults and treating trans men like property.
Sexual resource.
Sexual resource.
Both for reproduction and ensuring the survival of white Western civilization, and as a reward for our noble soldiers, fighting the degeneracy.
Was Kate? I was right.
Kate, okay.
Yeah. So that there are so many reasons it's so important to recognize that blocking transition-related healthcare often centers on attacking trans men, and people will dismiss that because trans men don't experience some unrelated oppression that women experience. And it's just like, we're going to ignore this completely because women have it worse, which is just so harmful to everyone. And this is just one example of derailing. It happens every single time trans men try to talk about experiences. Someone will say, well, what about this thing that women experience that you don't? And I'm going to get into that more later. Quote, thinly veiled debate, trans androphobia can't exist unless trans men have it worse than women. The trans man attempts to show a way trans men have it worse than women. By attempting to argue that trans men can sometimes have it worse than women, you've proven you're a misogynist, end quote. This argument actually got me yelled at for 6 hours straight. Well, not 6 hours straight. It got me yelled at for 6 hours. I had to go to bed in between because it was the middle of the night for me. I woke up. They were still so angry at me that they continued yelling at me for a few hours. And this seems to apply regardless of you can say something really obvious, such as trans men have harder times accessing healthcare for pregnancies than cis women.
Or cancer as well, cancer treatment, cancer testing, screening.
Cancer's true, but it's more obvious if I say pregnancy, because I'm not just talking about one that's correct, but one that's obvious.
Yeah, sorry.
Obviously, trans men are going to have a harder time accessing pregnancy-related healthcare. You can say that, and people will still say you're a misogynist for saying that trans men have it worse. It does not matter how narrow the scope of your argument is. It does not matter how indefensible it is. There are still people out there who will attack you for it. And as an example, the one that got me yelled at, I was simply talking about, I was upset. This was shortly after I called out Lily Orchard for saying that Tara Reid had lied. And her argument against me was, well, how dare this man mansplain to me about a sexual assault? Of course, raising that I'm a survivor of sexual assault and that I've experienced the impact of rape culture because, of course, the first 15 years of my life I was presenting as a girl. And as being accused of mansplaining, that was quite hurtful. And I just basically said, yeah, I was upset about the transandrophobia of that. And I was told that, it can't be transandrophobia unless trans women have power over trans men. I said, well, okay, in this specific case, this specific trans woman did use her gender and my gender in order to kind of have power over me. So, I'm not saying it's a widespread thing, but in this case, yeah, I think that this was a trans woman who, because of her gender and because of my gender, had that power over me. And I got yelled at for 6 hours. Yeah, and of course it was bait. It wasn't just a very unfair argument, but it was bait in that they specifically asked me to demonstrate. There's no reason why transandrophobia should imply that trans women have power over trans men. That's just something they made up. They made it up. They would not budge on it. They said you have to show I'm pretty sure I did try to say, hey, that doesn't make sense. And they would not budge. And they said, no, you have to show me this. And then when I did try to show them that, they said, well, you're a transmisogynist then. And so I said in my thread, I say, quote, I've never seen people tolerate rhetoric like this outside of discussions about trans men. I mean, they literally bait us. When's the last time you've had someone bait you in order to check your privilege? Do you see the parallels to abusive relationships? End quote. And yeah, I can't think of a time like if someone I when's the last time you've been checked on, for example, ableism, and you've been baited like that? When's the last time you've been checked on? You've seen like a cis man even be checked on misogyny or transmisogyny and get baited like that. I'm not saying it never happens outside of discussions about trans men because I haven't seen literally every interaction ever, but it's definitely something that happens way too often to trans men.
It's almost ritualized at this point.
Yeah.
Compared to trans men.
Yeah.
Because we all know the steps, we all know the motions, and that's why you've had this anxiety, like, going in. Like, you had a schema, you had an expectation of this is the steps that are going to happen. I'm going to post this thing. Someone's going to spot it. They're going to post about it. I'm going to be swarmed. You know.
And throughout this, something I should try and keep an eye on throughout this thread is when I've deliberately included things, excluded things. I've really tried to craft this thread in a way that would minimize the chances of that happening, or at least give me a shield if it did. Quote, as a side note, for all that people like to accuse trans men of MRA/incel rhetoric, a lot of the arguments used against us are literally MRA/incel/anti-feminist arguments with the serial numbers filed off. When trans men talk about our experiences on our own platforms, on our own time, without making any reference to anyone else's experiences, people often complain that we're derailing discussions about women's experiences. Not only is this indistinguishable from the classic "What about men?", but there's Darvo on top. Even though trans men are the ones being derailed and shut down, we're somehow the perpetrators just because we're men. Are you seeing the parallels to abusive relationships yet? End quote. And this is so frustrating to me.
I have got
because
go
so go ahead.
I was gonna say I just picked this off because again, I was in the secular community during the Gamergate era. I know exactly how like conversations of like sexual assault and stuff like that came up. Whenever cis guys would like swarm our post about sexual assault, the response we gave them was, "Hey, if you actually care about these topics, great. Go talk about them, use your own platforms, etc. We're talking about women right now, we're talking about trans people right now, we're talking about people of color right now. Like, you can go and do your own thing." I even helped, the person I founded my Atheist Humanist Secular Society with was someone who was doing a degree in psychology because he wants to specifically get into the field of helping male victims of rape and domestic abuse. And he was invited to the Feminist Society one night, like, "Hey, why don't you give a talk on the topic, because we are actually interested in it." It's just, the issue isn't that men can never talk about these issues. It's the fact that in like the Gamergate days, etc., they would just swarm any post, any discussion, anything that wasn't, any discussion about marginalized people or victims, they would just swarm and go, "What about us?" Or specifically, "What about people like me who have been through similar things?" And we just told them, if they want to talk about that elsewhere, we will support you 100% of the way, but this is wrong. And that's the thing. When it comes to trans men, I always fucking see they talk in their own platform. They talk on their own terms. They talk on like their own spaces. They are not taking up air from anyone else. But they're still treated as if they are those fucking invading monsters that we dealt with during Gamergate. They're treated as if they're the same. It's not the same thing. As someone who was at ground zero during those fucking horrible years, it's not the same thing, and it is obvious. So part of me wonders, like, that there's no way that these people can actually think that this is a good argument. They're just going for the optics here. They know what they're saying is wrong. But that doesn't matter. All they need is to parrot the narrative, which, you know, it's the exact same thing that goes on, like, the whole aggressive trans women sort of thing, the whole trans misogynist bullshit. It's just, it really, as someone who went through that, it hurts me to see it being used against trans men, but it also, I feel like it's a kick in the teeth for all of us who actually had to fight this back in the day, because it's like, this isn't it. This is not the same thing. You're cheapening, like, the violence that we went through. You're exploiting it, and you're cheapening it. You know, you're making it out to be absolutely nothing when that wasn't the case. You know, back in the day, people couldn't talk about their sexual assaults without being absolutely slaughtered online, like, majority-wise. Okay, that's not what trans men are doing. They're talking in their own little corner, and yet you still want to stamp them out. And it's just, yeah. Sorry. You go on.
No, don't say sorry. That was, I hadn't even considered any of that. I think that's really important. I'm glad you said it. Yeah, what I was going to say is, it almost doesn't stack up to that. The violence, like, not much stacks up to the violence of the Gamergate era. Of course, because I'm a very young man, I was not around, but I was looking at, I was watching videos and stuff during the Gamergate era, but I never really understood it. Even now, I don't entirely understand it, but I know enough to know about the whole thing of cis men, misogynistic cis men coming along and derailing discussions that women are having about their experiences, that marginalized people are having about their experiences, to say, what about cis men? And this is really frustrating for me as a trans man, because, of course, you have to remember that trans men are not cis men, and a lot of us have experiences learning about feminism as children, as teenagers, to understand our experiences with misogyny. And at least personally, I knew about this. I knew about the men who would swarm. And so in my own approach to talking about my experiences, talking about other people's experiences, I already knew, you know, it's not polite to, it's not fair to come onto people's posts and kind of say, oh, it's great you're talking about your experience as a trans woman or a non-binary person. Let's make this all about my experience as a trans man. And so I've always talked about things on my own platform, and I feel like a lot of trans men have. And like, this is because we also know the response. I knew the response. If I did try to go onto someone else's platform and be like, I'm going to make this about me, why aren't you talking about me? I knew the response would be, hey, that's great. Go talk about this yourself. Make this better yourself. This is my space to talk about my thing. And so I did that. And I think a lot of trans men did that, only to have people come to us and say, how dare you? Why aren't you talking about the rest of the trans community? Why aren't you supporting trans women? It's just,
it's effectively moving the goalposts from, like, what we tell cis men and holding you to, like, a higher standard. It's like, it's completely unfair. Like,
yeah. And they won't just say, how dare you, why aren't you talking about trans women? But they'll say, you're a trans misogynist. And of course, this also completely, the history of that particular person's posting will also be erased. You know, I could make 99 posts supporting trans women and one that's just focusing on trans men, and people could come to that and not know about, or not care to know about, my history of supporting trans women, and say, how dare you, trans misogynist? Why are you talking about trans men? You're ignoring the rest of us.
It reminds me of, I know this is kind of a, like, trivial kind of comparison, but back in my secular days, long ago, in the long time ago, back in my secular days, I mostly criticized Christians. But, like, I think I had a 1:11 ratio on Christian videos to Muslim videos, because once in a while, a Muslim apologist would say something I wanted to respond to. And yet, when I posted the one Muslim video, I'd always get accusations of why aren't you criticizing Christianity? And yet, when I also posted the Christian videos, I'd always get accusations of why aren't you criticizing Islam? It's like I have videos criticizing both in their own different ways because they're fundamentally different religions. If you want them, here they are. But yeah. I know that's sorry. It reminded me of that kind of thing.
It's not the same, but there are parallels there. I lost my train of thought a bit. Yeah, and it's just it is extremely frustrating as well because of course this is just blatantly Darvo. This is when it comes to us, the rule is let us talk on our own platforms, don't derail our post. But when it comes to you, the rule is, oh, you have to talk about us. We get to police what you talk about. You know, it is the what about men thing, but because it's coming from women, it's somehow okay. Or because it's coming from trans people, it's somehow okay. Just, and also, what was I going to say?
Sorry, I didn't mean to derail you.
It's partly me derailing myself. I really need to try to get in touch with a new psychiatrist and try to get on ADHD medication again. No, I think it's going. I'll probably think of it later.
Well, you can always come back to it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, I remember now. I remember. I don't remember exactly what it was because unfortunately, trans women attacked so much that the cases all kind of blurred together. But there was a situation where trans women were under fire again. It may have been Lily Cade, it may have been something else. But I noticed there were some trans women on Twitter complaining about how trans men were talking about why is nothing ever about trans men, and they're not incorrect. You know, if there were trans men complaining about trans men not getting attention while trans women are under fire, that's obviously not a nice thing to do. But I wish there had been a bit more compassion. I wish there had been an understanding that that was not just trans men being selfish, or probably not trans men just being selfish. There's a context there because it's not. People act like it's a thing of when trans women are especially under attack, we expect the community to come together and support them. But it's not like that. You know, during the times when things have cooled down, where things are not as difficult, where it's just the kind of undercurrent of transphobia that we always deal with. You know, trans men do try to talk about things, and we get shut down like this, and we get attacks like this, and there is this. There are people out there who literally think we should never get to speak, and then people will come along and say, "Hey, trans women are under attack. Why aren't you supporting them?" And it's like, because we never get any support ever. And there's also this really upsetting expectation for trans men to provide labor. I remember seeing someone outright say that it would be misogynistic for cis men of this marginalized demographic to not support, you know, it would be misogynistic for disabled cis men not to support disabled cis women. And so it's misogynistic for trans men not to support trans women. And, you know, I do think that we should support trans women. I think that's actually very important. But just the way it's talked about, it's like trans men owe the rest of the trans community this labor to make up for the privilege we gain. And no one ever even bothers to ask or to look into things to make sure we even have this privilege. It feels exactly like labor being, it feels way too similar to when labor is, to me, it just kind of feels like the expectation that was put on me before my transition to do labor, because people are just like, yeah, we can exploit you because of misogyny.
More recently, a more recent example that might click with a lot of people is how almost all marginalized groups feel when they're told by class reductionists to just shut up, let's deal with the class thing. Then we can start dealing with your like different forms of discrimination. You know, put in the labour, end class issues, and then we'll deal with racism and homophobia and you know everything else.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah, like you need to create a safe zone for yourself. I always work on the presumption of like creating a safe area to operate from. You need a control center, right? And if you don't feel safe in your control center, then you're not going to get fucking anything done. You're just going to burn yourself out repeatedly. So I
Yeah.
just wish
I
people
mean, like,
understood this, you know.
even if trans men were privileged, even over cis women, like this idea that we're never allowed to have any problems and it must be about everyone else all the time is just not healthy. It's not healthy for anyone. That's not even healthy for allo cis het men. And it really is, it is toxic masculinity that is being forced upon us by people who are supposed to be dismantling toxic masculinity, saying you're not allowed to confide in people about your struggles.
Effectively, they're telling you to man up. Which
Yeah, I mean, they literally do that sometimes.
that like carries with it like wow. That yeah.
I've even seen posts sometimes from other trans men, which is really disappointing, where people are saying, "Oh, if someone makes fun of you for your neckbeard or something, you shouldn't call that out. You should just man up and get over it. It's not a big deal. It's nothing compared to what trans women have to go through." And I saw this one post in particular where someone said, someone making fun of a trans man's body, his neckbeard or whatever, is not the same as someone making fun of a trans woman's small breasts because he can just shave. And like,
okay, by that logic,
it's not
let's talk about hairy legs.
Hmm.
That's the simplest way to like move the conversation over. Okay, let's talk about hairy legs and how that conversation gets, or facial hair on trans women. Let's talk about that. You know, it's yeah.
I mean, like, it's technically not untrue, but it's just like mocking people's bodies is bad. Actually, body positivity is good. Actually, it's just
Or body neutrality.
yeah,
That's a concept I've been reading about recently.
that's a good one.
Yeah, and how it's like you don't need to feel glorious about everything. Like you know, stretch marks aren't necessarily just tiger stripes or whatever, or like powerful symbols, but they can just your body can just be your body, and that can just be fine. Yeah.
Yeah, just basically, there's just this whole thing where trans men can be treated horribly
Pretty much,
because trans men have privilege.
the argument relies on the idea that trans women have it worse. Okay, well, we can take that a step further and say trans women of color have it worse. So all white trans women, suddenly you can't speak about anything except for issues with like trans women of color. Okay, disabled trans women of color have it worse. So suddenly all like trans women of color, they can't speak about the issues. It has to be about disabled trans women of color. Like it's the same thing of like, oh, you don't have a bad life. There's someone else out there who has it worse, therefore you can't talk about your issue. And it's like there's always going to be someone who has it worse.
Actually, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of when predominantly white women in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, I think it's mostly the United States, would talk about the issues they face with things like sexual harassment, feeling unsafe. There was Elevator Gate. And then anti-feminists would come along and say, oh, you think you're oppressed? Just look at what women in Saudi Arabia have to deal with. I can't believe you're whining about this.
The whole Richard Dawkins, Dear Muslina, was it? It was like writing. He was role-playing a Muslim woman writing to, yeah. But,
yeah. Just donate to Africa. Yeah, it's yeah, and it's very much pressuring trans men not to open up about anything, which is really harmful for a group that I mean, when you're trans, you're disconnected from your experiences, and then um, on top of that, you're being told you're not allowed to open up, you're not allowed to process that. But so many things I'll touch on throughout the thread. I should keep reading the thread. No, you're fine. So this is actually something I specifically included, partly because I think it's really, really important, but also partly to ward off accusations of transmisogyny. If I address transmisogyny, if I say that it's bad, then it's less likely that people will accuse me of being transmisogynistic. But yes, quote. But what really, really disturbs me is how many of these arguments are transmisogynistic turf rhetoric with the serial numbers filed off. For example, the assertion that trans men don't understand misogyny because we no longer experience it post-transition, citation needed, is just a gender-flipped and a time-flipped version of the whole jumping on a train mid-journey argument turf spout, i.e. the idea that trans women can't understand misogyny because they didn't experience cis misogyny as children. I hope I don't need to spell out the myriad problems with that, end quote. For anyone who doesn't know, the jumping on a train mid-journey argument is, there was this argument that basically being a woman is like if you're on a train ride for your whole life. The train is misogyny, and being on the train is women's experiences, which, as we know, are all monolithic and completely the same. And trans women are getting on the train halfway through and acting like they understand the whole journey, which is completely ridiculous. You know, just because someone doesn't understand the first half of the journey doesn't mean they can't understand the second half of the journey. And doesn't mean that they don't experience the trauma of the second half of the journey. Also, the first half of the journey for people who are getting on that train may not be the same as the people who are on that train, but doesn't necessarily mean that they were on the train of men's experiences either. Trans women experience, higher rates of sexual assault. Trans women, a lot of them are seen as gender non-conforming as children, and that's going to impact things. It's just, there are so many problems with that. And of course, people are coming along, supposedly trans-inclusive people, trans people even, Aurelia is saying, and it plays into the turf argument that trans men are just women fleeing misogyny. Yes, absolutely. So people who are supposedly trans-inclusive and people who are trans themselves are coming along and basically saying, oh, trans men were on the woman train and then halfway through jumped off and then got onto the men train. And therefore that time on the woman train doesn't matter anymore and they don't understand. There are a lot of people who are really wonderful and do listen to trans men about our experiences, but there are so many people who will just erase those experiences completely and act like they don't happen. Unfortunately, even for people who do listen and accept our experiences, there's just so little language that it's something I'll expand on later. But the point here is, of course, it's the exact same argument. It's this argument that if you don't have this experience with cis misogyny, your experience with transmisogyny, or your experience with oppression that is adjacent to misogyny, it doesn't count because it doesn't fit into this monolithic cis experience. And I also said, quote, another example is the presupposition that trans men benefit from male privilege post-transition, despite how our identities and experiences make us different from cis men. While not identical, it's scarily similar to the idea that trans women have male privilege pre-transition, end quote. And this, when I realized this, it was kind of a light bulb moment for me, in that, but for me personally, I find I don't experience a whole lot of male privilege, even though I pass very well, because I honestly don't want it. I could go into men's spaces, but I don't like being in them. if there are a bunch of men who are being misogynistic because they don't think any women are around, that's quite traumatizing for me. Because I'm neurodivergent, I don't fit in because I haven't learned the norms for those spaces, and honestly, I do not have the energy to learn them right now. I may not have the energy because autistic burnout, is a bitch. And even if I could get along in those spaces, I really don't want male privilege as something that I've been trying to reject ever since I started transitioning to the best of my ability, because I'm very against male privilege as a concept. And all of this is just completely erased. People just will act like, oh, you're a trans man, so you're exactly like a cis man. And even worse, there's this presumption that trans men are trying to like game the system and take full advantage of male privilege, not just to benefit ourselves, but to be misogynistic. If there's an opportunity for people to assume trans men, to think that trans men are being misogynistic, there are a lot of people out there who will take it. There's kind of like this idea that trans men are especially evil because we're men. And I realized that it is so scarily similar to transmisogyny, because of course trans women are not men, but bigots will pretend that they are anyway, and basically say, because you're a man, you're especially evil on this spiritual level. And so I think a lot of trans people have kind of come along and they've made the obvious arguments, this isn't true because trans women aren't men. But they never actually addressed this idea that men are like especially evil or intrinsically evil. It really is just swapping out bioessentialism for gender essentialism. And I realized this is something that people will turn back on trans when the moment it's convenient for them. It kind of reminds me of when back when gay rights was a hot issue, and people would say, well, you shouldn't be homophobic because gay people are born that way. And then later on, they had to kind of come back and say, but also, even if it was a choice, that's completely fine, and people should be free to make that choice. Because if you don't, then you're kind of leaving this idea in the zeitgeist of, being gay is bad, and if you can avoid it, then you should.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're kind of doing the same thing. There's this idea floating around that issues with the horrible things cis men do, it's not because of any kind of patriarchy, it's not because of any kind of social pressures, it's not because of any kind of systemic issues, it's because men are spiritual, like they have this evil within them because they are men. Being a man makes you evil and tainted. And when people try to apply that to trans women, instead of saying, actually, no, there's nothing intrinsically bad about maleness. Of course, we don't want people treating trans women like men, so we say trans women aren't men, but then we don't come back and say also being a man is fine, actually. So I said, quote, "It's all transmisogyny, and yet so many people are treating it like this feminist power move. Not only that, they're using these arguments to defend trans women from Czech's notes, trans men talking about our own experiences. It sickens me." End quote. They are demon-possessed monsters, Biggio says. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the thing is, you can try to say that this isn't transmisogyny because it's happening to some men, and that's true, but like, it's the same arguments. It is the exact same arguments with the gender swapped around. This is going to come back and hurt trans women as well.
I mean, I have as a trans femme person, I have never felt afraid of a trans man talking about himself on his own fucking platform. I have some concerns about certain cliquiness that certain trans femmes get engaged in on places like Twitter. That concerns me. But yeah, it's just it's this invention of a problem, and then pretending like, you know, oh, we have this like duty to like root out these evil, you know, trans misogynist trans men is like, you know, actually, like, who the fuck?
You know what really angers me as well is when trans men and trans masks actually are being trans misogynistic, which, spoiler alert, does happen actually. No one cares. No one actually does anything about it. They're completely fine with it because it's always people who are famous.
Are we thinking about Bucket Angel here?
I was actually thinking about people who have mistreated you.
Oh, okay. But yeah.
Yeah.
Especially if it's a cis woman like that. Like, similar with you and you this post, like when I put the Jill Bear video out and I was criticizing a very popular white cis woman, like I burnt through so much of like my spoons just anxiety wise over those weeks, and it just like the Tom Scott video itself wasn't that hard by comparison. I'm pretty sure I just burnt through myself that like the 2 weeks I was working on the actual Jill Bear video because I was so fucking terrified of what was coming, you know. But
yeah, when transmisogyny is actually happening, no one cares, and I do think partly that is because it is generally powerful people who it's harder to stand up against. But you know, it's like, why aren't you putting your effort into building up that power to hold those people accountable? Why instead are you going after people who are literally just minding their own business? And it's because it's not actually about trans misogyny. It's not actually about making things better for trans femmes.
Power over somebody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
But no, you're fine. Yeah, I said, quote, "I'm just so done. This men bad attitude is so pervasive and so harmful to men, and fundamentally anti-feminist and misogynistic and trans-misogynistic, but we let it persist because we've decided that the aesthetic of punching up is more important than actually punching up." Quote, and that's kind of the issue here is we a lot of people are not thinking in terms of how can we make things better for people. They're just thinking of making things better for, not even better for women, but just like worse for men to, I guess, get back at men for having it better than women, even when we don't.
It's a very binaristic perspective that just ignores intersectionality, which woman good, men bad. And like that has all sorts of implications, not just in the fucking trans community. Like we see it also in a lot of like other communities with other groups as well. Like just, I'm sorry.
And I think it's also, yeah, it's a lot. I think also just a lot of people are in a very negative mindset of trying to lash out, trying to silence, trying to hurt, rather than trying to uplift people. And that's kind of something I think we slide into because we are in a very negative society. But also, like we're in a very like negative and violent society, and we're kind of taught that mindset. But also, it's just easier. It's easier to just lash out at people that don't have much power than it is to work on making things better. But it's so disappointing because the whole point of being on the left, the whole point of being a feminist, the whole point of being a humanist, etc., is supposed to be to make things better. And so many people would rather lash out at marginalized men to feel like they're raising women up. It's just. And Aurelia says the aesthetic of punching up. Thank you, seriously, thank you, Levi. You're welcome. I do have good ideas sometimes. Finally I said, quote, "One thing that I will never get over because it is so, so incredibly hurtful, is how casually people will compare trans men to incels and MRAs. That is so utterly disgusting and unacceptable. You know what incels and MRAs are like. You know they would never accept a trans man. I did not get hit, sexually abused, and treated like property because I was a girl, only for people to turn around 10 years later and compare me to the people who support that violence, who want to do it themselves. You do not get to tell men that we are the same as our abusers just because you're pissy that a man on the internet told you, no, you don't get to derail my thread, or no, you don't get to police my language, or no, you shouldn't dismiss my experiences. Learn some respect, end quote. And this is kind of getting at an issue I've seen where people are so quick to compare trans men specifically to MRAs, to incels, to anti-feminists, to people who hate women, so quick to call us misogynists and transmisogynists. I never see, I'm not saying that it never happens to cis men unfairly, because I have seen it happen to queer cis men unfairly as well. But no one is as quick to use those labels against trans men. And it is so incredibly painful.
Do you know what it kind of reminds me of?
What?
It kind of reminds me, like, because, like, oh, you're a man now, so I get to treat you like shit. It reminds me of, oh, you're a feminist, equality, so I get to hit women.
Yeah.
You know, by twisting of your own view, I can, like, make it out so I can do this horrific thing, and just, yeah.
Something I mentioned in reply to some people who had replied to my thread is that trans men are men, which was supposed to be, originally was, a slogan of support and affirmation, has been turned into a threat. People will say, when people say trans women are women, trans men are men, then that's fine. That's clearly supported. But when people just say trans men are men on its own, honestly, at this point, 90% of the time, they are saying, because you are a man, I'm going to assume that you are an allo-cishet, a misogynistic allo-cishet abled white man, and I will treat you accordingly. Like I've seen people who literally in black and white say that men are misogynistic, or men can be. Read men are misogynistic. Trans men are men, therefore trans men are misogynistic. Completely erasing our experiences with misogyny, and our desire for people to not experience that because we know what it's like, and our understanding of misogyny because we've been through it. And actually, one thing that really gets me is how people are so people make a point whenever trans men try to talk about our experiences of jumping in and immediately saying, oh, but trans men have male privilege. And, it is true in some ways. For example, because I pass, I don't have to worry about street harassment. I've never actually experienced catcalling because I was lucky enough not to experience it when I was younger. And of course, I'm not going to experience it now. But I don't understand why, of all of the men you could approach to explain this sort of thing to, why would you approach trans men who, by your own logic, have seen how much their lives have improved because of male privilege firsthand? Like by these people's logic, trans men would know better than they do, and they're going up to trans men, and it has mansplaining energy. Just let me lecture you on male privilege and how much you have, and how it benefits you. I, someone who doesn't know your experiences, because clearly you as someone who experienced misogyny and now experiences less of it, you wouldn't understand. No one does this to cis men. I don't see people going up to cis men to make sure they understand how much male privilege they have.
Cis white men. I do need
cis white men,
because it does happen to black men. Like white women using this rhetoric. And that's one of the points I wanted to get to, because I'm just to be clear, as fucking horrific as what happens with white trans men and your experiences compared to even black cis men, like the way white cis women will weaponize the exact same rhetoric. And that's the thing. Like, we're not helping black cis men, or like worse, black trans men in the community. We're not helping protect them from that by like pretending the sort of rhetoric is okay when it comes to white trans men, because it kind of acts like a training ground of like, oh, there's this particularly this upper class white clique of like trans women and cis women who like all hang around with each other. They learn that anytime they want to shut down a marginalized voice, here's how to do it. Benevolent patriarchy, pretty much. Whilst acting as if it's feminist. Sorry, I just wanted to correct that.
No, thank you for picking me up on that, because the thing is, I was going to talk about the experiences of black trans men. I was going to talk a bit about the whiteness of it all, but I somehow completely let that slip. I'm kind of mad at myself because I've been trying to train myself to always consider the racial aspect. But I got so caught up in talking about my own experiences, I forgot about that.
It's not an issue. We caught it, okay? That's the important thing. We caught it, okay. Sorry, as you were.
Yeah.
You don't see them doing the same to white cis men.
Yeah, I don't see people doing the same thing to white cis men, and it just shows this has nothing to do with awareness. This has nothing to do with making sure that people don't forget the benefits of male privilege. It's just about, it's about erasing trans men's experiences, and it's about artificially putting us on a pedestal of privilege that we're not on. Because like definitely trans men can use especially it depends of course on race, it depends on that way you pass, etc. It depends on how well you conform to hegemonic masculinity, but there are definitely trans men out there who can benefit from being men. But this issue is not talked about in proportion to how often it happens, which communities it happens in. It's not addressed when it needs to be. It's just constantly brought up whenever trans men are trying to talk about our experiences. One thing that really frustrates.
Sorry, go
on. One thing that really, I was going to say frustrates, but honestly, this really scared me, and it still does. Is like there are definitely toxic trans men out there, Buck Angel, Calvin Garra, who do all sorts of horrible things and use masculinity to help them with that. And as you move further away from the left, you're probably more likely to find toxic trans men and trans men who are happy to assimilate into patriarchy. But from the way people talk, you would be forgiven for thinking that like the spaces I'm in online specifically are saturated with deeply misogynistic and transmisogynistic trans men. And it was at a point, I think I mentioned this I think during the emergency stream a few months ago, where I will see people vaguely complaining about trans men, and I will feel like I have to keep an eye on that person because I don't know if they're genuinely venting about something that happened or if they're talking about bullshit that has been made up. Yeah. Yes. Something so that's my thread. I'm definitely forgetting a whole lot of things because this issue it's just huge. But something I learned from people replying to the thread, from all the reach it got and discussions around it. Actually, so before I go on to that, one thing I should talk about some more is the lack of language is a huge issue. And every time trans men have tried to create language to talk about our experiences, there's always been some reason why that language hasn't been acceptable. And it is held to such a ridiculous level of scrutiny. Like you're expected to basically have a completely watertight sociological theory about whatever you're talking about before it's deemed acceptable. And this is something you may have only just started exploring and just started putting words to. And there's just kind of um, there's no compassion and there's no support when it comes to trans men trying to process some very complicated, difficult, and traumatic experiences. Um, and of course, we saw this when some trans men started talking about transmisandry. People stepped in, and the argument wasn't something like, "Hey, I get what you're saying. The substance of what you're saying is important, but given the history of, given how misandry has been used, I think it makes me feel a bit uncomfortable, and I think it would make other people feel a bit uncomfortable, and I'm worried about how it could be abused. Could we try to come up with a separate word?" No. The response was, "How dare you? Misandry doesn't exist, and how dare you appropriate the experiences of trans women by suggesting that trans men have equivalent experiences? And how does that even make sense? Transmisogyny is transphobia plus misogyny, and so if misandry doesn't exist, how can you have transphobia mixed with misandry?" And just people just going on these really weird tangents about things that no one ever said, not even caring to listen before dismissing these experiences. And when I talked about being yelled at for 6 hours, it was actually because I used the word transmisandry. When I the people yelling at me, they agreed that transandrophobia exists. So that whole experience, all of that abuse, was because I used a word they don't like. And same thing happened when there are people who have issues with the word transandrophobia as well. I can't remember what they are. I think some people were saying it was just people trying to get transmisandry under the radar, which is ridiculous, because I thought the problem with transmisandry was because it was an upsetting word. It's just there was a word that a trans guy came up with, TPAF, trans person assigned female, which was supposed to be to talk about experiences trans men, trans mascs, and non-binary folk have around discrimination and violence because of having a uterus, or being assumed to have a uterus, and stuff like that. Issues with things like pregnancy and abortion and those kinds of reproductive healthcare. It was designed to be as inclusive as possible and to try to talk about those experiences without misgendering anyone, without putting anyone else's experiences down. And that is seen as having issues, and you get attacked for using that word now. And for me personally, at least with my experiences, this has messed things up for me so much that for years I've honestly been wondering in the back of my head if I'm not non-binary or not, because I find it really difficult to identify fully as a man, and I find I still feel a very strong connection to the identity of being a woman, even though I would never call myself that. And I was wondering, am I non-binary? Am I non-binary? And every time I ask myself that, I would think, well, I don't want to call myself non-binary. That feels wrong. So I guess I'm not, but I still feel in between genders. And I just could not put my finger on why. And I think the reason why is because my trauma is so bound up in things that are considered women's experiences exclusively. And that even if I did try to talk about these things as men's experiences, things would get lost in translation, because we have this idea that all men are cis, that it's messed with my own sense of my gender. Something I...
Sorry, back in a second. Continue talking.
Yeah. Something I've been thinking about lately is we're very good at the trans community. In the trans community, we're very good at understanding that woman could mean cis woman, trans woman, or non-binary woman. And when someone says woman, that doesn't necessarily mean cis woman. But when someone says man, that is always assumed to mean cis man. There's no room for anyone else. And this is something that trans men have been pointing out for ages, saying you don't see us as men. And it took me forever to figure out what that meant. And of course, it's this idea that men can only be cis. And so there's not room for those experiences.
Term that I
And
kind of, also,
yeah, no, go ahead.
I
Go
said the
ahead.
term that I kind of remember like talking to you about is alienation.
Mm,
The way that like trans men are separated from their experiences, from their lived trauma,
mm.
um, and yeah, they're kind of held at a distance from all that. Um,
Yeah, like the best I can hope for is if I put things in terms of being assigned female at birth, if I really emphasize how much this was because of being perceived as a girl or a woman, people will take it seriously. If I ever try to relate, if I ever try to talk about this from my perspective as a trans man, it's not going to be taken seriously. And even if I wanted to, even if it was going to be taken seriously, there just aren't, there's not language and there isn't a framework to talk about that. And this is really deep trauma as well. Like recently I realized I I don't feel comfortable sleeping on my back because of having to worry about my brother like coming into my room at night and assaulting me. And like I can't, how do I talk about that? I can't because there's just no recognition. Um and the other day I was talking to someone about uh another CSA survivor about my experiences with CSA, and I had to and of course he's a cis man. I had to explain to him my trauma isn't so much around the assault; it's around the cultural narratives that basically say that what happened to me was okay and even good. The idea that yes, women or people with uteruses should be property. Um, no, their consent doesn't matter. No, their autonomy doesn't matter. These cultural narratives reinforcing that trauma is why I'm so traumatized now. And like, how do you talk about that as a trans man? There just isn't any way to talk about that. Um, so there are huge problems with a lack of language that not only are not addressed in the trans community, not only are supported by, including trans men in these ways. But like every time we try to come up with language, we're shut down and attacked for being misogynistic or transmisogynistic somehow. But yeah, something I also learned from the replies to my thread is I had kind of assumed that non-binary people hopefully didn't experience this as much. I imagined for at least for non-trans masculine binary people, it would be easier for them not to be demonized as men because they weren't like fully siding with the enemy or whatever. But it turns out no. A lot of non-binary people have this experience where people will kind of pick and choose which side they're on based on whatever is convenient. And they're kind of being caught in the middle of all this, which is quite awful. I wish I could go into more detail about experiences. Obviously, that's not my experience. I did want to acknowledge that non-binary people are also caught up in this, pretty much regardless of their uh, what their gender is, what their presentation is, and also, of course, trans men of color are really badly impacted by all of this. This has been traumatizing for me, and all I have to deal with is my experiences with misogyny being erased, and to an extent, my neurodivergence being erased as well. But trans men of color have to deal with being treated like white cis men.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and Of course, we've already seen issues with uh, certain people. That there's been some instances with privileged white trans women, especially, who will use transmisogyny to say this trans man is being transmisogynistic against me because he's an awful trans man, and will completely erase the racial aspect of it, that this is a white person being racist and violent against a black person or a brown person, or an Asian person, or a native person. But also trans men of color are just not considered at all. This narrative of trans men being privileged kind of makes sense for white trans men a little bit, but trans men of color, for example, a black trans man has to deal with the extreme violence that black cis men have to deal with, but without having their whole life to learn how to deal with that, without being prepared for it. And then on top of that, trans people are treating them like they're white cis men, saying they're privileged. And it's like the privilege. What privilege? The privilege to be, shot at. It's all so clear in my head and I'm blanking. I think I'm a bit tired. As a huge issue I've noticed and I've been thinking about for months is that, at least on white Twitter, we're very good at sharing mutual aid posts from white trans people, trans women, trans men, and non-binary people. And we're also very good at talking about supporting black trans women and Latina trans women, which is great. But a lot of trans people of color, and especially trans men, kind of gets overlooked because it's like, well, then they're privileged. And so even though trans men of color are more disadvantaged than a white trans person will ever be, they're not being supported. Because of this narrative that men are privileged.
I remember when Tony McDade was murdered by police, and Fred Sargent, the Stonewall appropriator who's a fucking cop, was openly celebrating his murder as a black trans man. And very few people talked about it. Like, we covered it, like the black trans community covered it, but outside, it was crickets everywhere.
And trans men of color are also massively impacted by, I feel like there's a complete deficit of language, and I feel like there's a complete deficit of representation when it comes to white trans men. So just imagine how much worse it is for trans men of color, having to deal with some, I feel like my experiences are complicated, but just imagine what it's like for someone who was who kind of, I don't want to say lived as a woman because it's more complicated than that, but was perceived as a woman, was treated like a woman, with all of the baggage that comes with things like misogynoir, and then adding transes to that. I would love to. I'd love to unpack that and just explain how difficult it is. I've seen threads here and there, people just talking about it on the barest surface level, and it is so complicated. Yeah. Uh, but yeah, my point is.
Oh, we have just received 50 Danish kroner from Moif. Thank you. Thank you for the videos. Stay safe. Thank you for the donation. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I really do wish I could give insight to just how important it is, but of course I can't because these aren't my experiences. But we need to, my point is that we really need to, in general, we need to
reflect on how we
make
do
space
things.
in our, we need to make space in the trans community for more diverse experiences. And in particular, we need to be more comfortable with trans men discussing their experiences, because trans men of color in particular need to be able to unpack their experiences. And this narrative of how dare men talk about anything is really harmful to that.
Mm-hmm. It's,
I really do hope I didn't. I'm sorry. I really do hope I didn't overstep there. I really.
Levi. Calm. Everything's fine. Okay, everything's fine. Calm down.
I did want to include some threads that I had seen, but because of how controversial this topic is, I needed to reach out to people to ask for permission, and I tried for 2 days, but I was just paralyzed with anxiety.
And this isn't the end of the topic. We can always return to it. Okay.
Yeah.
This isn't the end. This is the beginning of the conversation. And that's the important thing to keep in mind of. Like, a lot of the stuff we talk about on here is stuff we experiment with, and we'll go on to talk about in videos and everything like that. You know, and it impacts what we do with, like, in future shows and stuff. You know, we were talking about anti-Semitism in the gender critical movement, and then we went and we got ourselves a Jewish voice to come on and talk about that. We've talked about disability and how that intersects with being trans, and again we were on Robin. So yes, it's the start of the conversation, and we can do better and move forward. Okay.
Yeah, but I do really want to emphasize just give more marginalized trans men space to talk about their experiences. It's very complicated, and you do need to listen, actually. But I guess the only other thing I wanted to talk about on this topic for now is actually some things I'm kind of grateful for, as much as seeing this stuff has been traumatizing. Is it's taught me how to talk about my experiences with oppression without putting other people's experiences down, without delegitimizing them. Because when you deal with an environment where you have to worry about people tearing strips off of you if you ever dare to say that you have it worse than someone, where even if you bring statistics to the discussion, people will still find fault with you, saying you have it worse. You have to find some other framework. I feel like people do tend to say, tend to talk too much about, for example, people will say misogyny. The problem with this misogynistic discrimination is that women are worse off than men. And like, that's for example, the wage gap. That's true. And comparing people's experiences is a good way to see that there is something wrong going on there. But also, you can just say the fact that this is happening to someone is bad.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, with medical discrimination, I could look up some statistics and say, well, trans men have poorer health outcomes than these groups of people. But if I do that, especially if the health outcomes are worse for, if the health outcomes are worse for cis women, we're going to be called a misogynist. If trans men's health outcomes are worse, then trans women are going to be called a transmisogynist. So it's much easier to say, well, as a trans man, trans men can't get proper access to, like I said before, pregnancy-related healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
That's a problem. That's an oppression. I think it is a much more constructive way to go about things.